Amy, just explain to us, if you would, how might the American promise of these long-range missiles for Ukraine change the course of the war, change the course of the fighting?
Well, good afternoon, Jamie. Ukraine has been calling for these longer-range rocket systems for a long time because what the Ukrainians want to do is to make it more difficult for the Russians to prepare an offensive this coming spring by being able to attack their rear ammunition depots, their rear command and control centers, their supply routes, and so on, making it very difficult for the Russians to mass to attack. The problem is that with the systems that the West has given Ukraine at the moment, the Ukrainians can strike up to 50 miles. But the Russians, of course, are not silly, and they've simply moved their command posts back beyond the 50-mile range, meaning that, of course, Ukraine now needs systems that can go up to 90 miles. And this is what these new US ground-launched small diameter bombs that you were referring to, Jamie, would allow the Ukrainians to do.
Can we talk about the weapons that are not being sent?
Well, we certainly can, but I do also think it's worth emphasizing, just very briefly for your viewers, that this has been a good week for the Ukrainians, not just because of this US decision that you referred to, but because the Germans are now sending Leopard 1 tanks as well as Leopard 2 tanks. The French and the Italians are now going to send a very sophisticated air defense system, similar to the US Patriot, for instance. The French have offered more artillery. So it's not been a bad couple of days. But to respond specifically to your question, the first thing that Ukrainians say they need are simple things like far more 155mm ammunition, the kind of standard weapon that is fired by artillery. And they need that to hold the Russians back at the moment in Bakhmut and Solidar in the Donbass, where, as you well know, the Russians have been advancing. Not massively, but advancing. Then, of course, Jamie, we're going to get into the whole debate about aircraft, which has already started. And should the West start giving Ukrainians F-16 and fighter jets. But the third thing, which I think Ukrainians need more than anything else now, is the integration of all these systems. They have over 300 different radar systems, and we're now, having different types of artillery, different types of tanks, different types of air defense systems. And the key need is to integrate all of this into what we call combined arms operations. And again, there's been some good news for the Ukrainians, because this week the US announced that it was coming up with a software package which could integrate and make interoperable all of these different air defense systems. Of course, training, maintenance of all of the systems, tanks need a lot of maintenance spare parts. That's also going to be a vital part of this endeavor going ahead.
Hardware and software obviously grabbing today's news headlines, but the other thing to talk about is the importance of finding people to train the staff to use these things, the personnel, the skills base, and the ammunition. Those are also very significant, aren't they?
They are, but there have been some good developments. I mean, yesterday the European Union chiefs were in Kiev for the EU-Ukraine summit, and the EU announced that it was doubling the number of Ukrainian soldiers that it's going to train from 15,000 to 30,000. Many countries have stepped up, of course, their training programs, even anticipating, like the Poles did with tanks, the decision to actually supply the Ukrainians with tanks. So maybe with aircraft, we'll see in future that Ukrainian pilots will start the training well ahead of an actual decision to hand the aircraft over. The other thing is that the countries in Europe which have the Leopard 2 tank have formed a 12-nation consortium so that they can collectively come up with ammunition, spare parts, maintenance, do all of this, in sort of consolidated centres, which will, I think, keep the supply chain running. So it's starting to happen. But, of course, for the Ukrainians anticipating a spring offensive, is it going to happen fast enough?
Well, let's talk about that spring offensive. Lots of analysts are suggesting there's going to be a Russian spring offensive. What is your assessment?
Well, the Russians certainly seem to be sort of preparing for one, and by trying to capture some of these towns in the Donbass region, which have been bitterly contested during the winter. Everybody's now, I think, heard of Bakhmut and Solidar. If the Russians could succeed, not only would, of course, they win a badly needed victory after, of course, the setbacks that they suffered at the hands of the Ukrainians last autumn, but they would put themselves in a pretty strong position to strike out further into the Donbass, particularly towards towards significant towns like Zaporizhzhia or Kramatorsk. The other thing is that clearly I think the Russians will want to sort of strike in the south as well. Putin's aim clearly is to try to conquer all of the territories which he claims Russia has already annexed. The Russians have clearly spent the winter months trying to restock and resupply. They hope that by the end of the winter they would have fully drafted the 300,000 troops that they called up. They've even announced an increase in their armed forces. So all of these kind of things suggest, together with Putin's rhetoric, that his aim is still to subjugate all of Ukraine and take out the regime of President Zelensky. All of this suggests that, you know, Putin is doubling down and that therefore the Russians will certainly try to seize more territory.
And to what extent does Russia have the ability, the capacity to resupply its weaponry?
Well, Jamie, this, of course, is what in the US they like to call the $64,000 question. It's difficult to tell. The Russians, of course, claim that they can keep going for as long as they like, that they're nowhere near running out of missiles, and that they're reopening production lines. And certainly, you know, Putin is getting enough money coming in from oil and gas sales, despite the Western sanctions, to be able to sort of keep going for a while yet. Russia has an enormous arms capacity, and there is speculation that Russia might be calling up an extra 500,000 conscripts. Putin, as I said, shows no sign of backing down. Yet, on the other hand, you know, there are some sort of indications that they're beginning to feel the pressure. For example, you may have seen, your viewers may have seen, that this week the Russians have stopped issuing biometric passports because they want to keep the chips that you use, the microprocessors for biometric passports, presumably to put in their weapon systems. So certainly, yes, they will be experiencing glitches. But you can't underestimate them. And of course, they're reaching out to countries like North Korea and Iran for drones and missiles to make up their own shortfall. So they're going to not be as strong as they normally would like to be, but only an idiot would write the Russians off at this stage.